I'm Jan, this is Prague Pulse, and here is what a President Kamala Harris would mean for Europe, and more specifically for the countries in the heart of Europe. Let's dive in. Now first, as you probably know, Joe Biden, the outgoing president, has always been incredibly proud to invoke his European roots. Indeed, he is actually Irish-American himself. Yes, it's been more than 165 years since Biden's ancestors actually made the leap across the Atlantic, but that doesn't stop him from invoking his Irish blood whenever he sees fit, several generations down the line.
As long as I can remember, it's been sort of part of my soul.
He has a penchant for reciting lines from his favorite Irish poets when making remarks.
If you're lucky enough to be Irish, well, you're lucky enough.
And he regularly shares words of wisdom from relatives shaped by the Irish experience.
If you forgive the poor attempted Irish, Tamasha Walya, I'm at home.
Former Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar even called him a son of Ireland. And given that very personal link to Europe, it is not surprising that Biden has actually been genuinely interested in maintaining a strong transatlantic link between the US and the EU. Maybe more so than other US presidents who lacked that very personal connection and the lifelong first-hand experience with Europe. Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, had plunged NATO into uncertainty because of his astounding lack of coherence.
This is a tough hurricane, one of the wettest we've ever seen from the standpoint of water. It's tremendously big and tremendously wet.
He even threatened that the US might leave the alliance entirely. Biden's administration, on the other hand, has repeatedly reaffirmed its commitment to the collective security of Europe. That has been especially important for the countries in the heart of the continent, given that they literally share a border with NATO's enemies, and with Ukraine, against which Russia wages an aggressive war. Put simply, the capital cities of some European NATO allies are just a few minutes away from Russian missiles. Combine that with the fact that military spending by many European NATO allies remains disastrously low. Plus, many European armies would not be even capable of fighting given the terrible state of their military hardware. We all remember reports like this one from just a few years ago, whereas Germany boasts one of the largest armies in Europe, at least on paper, only a third of all military assets were apparently operational back in 2018. I mean, granted, the situation has improved since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but still, Europe wouldn't survive for long without the US. And in this climate, Joe Biden has simply served as a reassurance for the safety and security of Europe. Now, before we continue, if you like this video and my content, as always, please don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, a huge thank you to everyone supporting me on herohero.co/PraguePulse. You may not believe it, but every single one of you gives me the energy to keep going. You're truly incredible. And now, let's keep going. Obviously, Europeans have now somewhat lost the reassurance when Joe Biden dropped out of the race for the White House last month. Kamala Harris is a West Coast native who was first elected senator nearly 3 decades after the Cold War ended. And as such, she understandably doesn't share Biden's lifelong experience with Europe, nor the first-hand experience with the expansionist policies of the Soviet Union from the Cold War era. The second way in which a Harris presidency would differ from Biden is that her vice presidential career was not really preceded by any significant work on foreign affairs. Biden, on the other hand, was the senior Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for more than a decade before joining Barack Obama's ticket. I mean, obviously, Biden is much older than Harris, and so, of course, he has been on the political stage for longer. But still, it is safe to say that Harris is somewhat of a tabula rasa in international politics. One example, yes, Harris may have been the last person in the room when Biden decided on the US exit from Afghanistan, but no one really knows exactly what her contribution to that decision was. Now, because Harris has had limited visibility on the international stage, allies are of course watching closely whom she chooses as her closest advisors. I would even argue that, given her limited experience with foreign policy, her advisors are absolutely crucial in shaping her foreign policy agenda. And we may actually have some good news for Europeans there. It is very likely that this guy, Phil Gordon, will hold a top national security job in a possible Harris administration. He could even replace Jake Sullivan as the US National Security Advisor, and so be absolutely crucial for shaping Harris's foreign policy agenda. Why is that such a big deal? Well, Gordon is a confirmed Europhile. You see, he speaks 4 European languages, which in itself is unusual for a US politician.
I went to an Ivy League school. I'm very highly educated. I know words. I have the best words. But there's no better word than stupid.
Has written his university thesis on Charles de Gaulle and even translated a book by former French President Nicolas Sarkozy into English. The lifelong career diplomat and academic has already served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs in the first Obama administration. He supports the growing strategic autonomy of Europe and doesn't see that as a threat to the US, which is in direct opposition to Donald Trump, of course. And he also supports continuing US help to Ukraine, which is also more than could be said about Trump. Plus, Gordon's passion for Europe is not just in the policy sphere. He also loves football, and I mean the proper kind, not the American version of rugby. Once, Gordon apparently even forced Hillary Clinton to watch a football match, a proper football match, on TV. So, if Gordon really does get an important job on the Harris team, it will be good news for Europe, which will have an ally in Washington. But that still does not change the fact that Europe will never again be the #1 policy priority for the US. You see, Gordon himself recognizes that. When asked about the biggest challenges facing the US at a conference recently, Gordon first started talking about China, and only then did he mention Europe and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So, a President Harris would probably not ignore Europe entirely. Undoubtedly, there would be a certain degree of continuity from the Biden administration to a Kamala Harris presidency in terms of ideals, actions, and advisors. But we cannot afford to be complacent. The US electorate and policymakers on both sides of the spectrum are shifting toward more isolation. The US is most likely not going to save us if we decide to keep ignoring our own security and safety. Third, just as Europe would not be Harris's #1 priority in foreign policy, it would also be very much on the back burner in economic relations. It is very likely that Harris would continue in Biden's footsteps. Let's remember that in 2019, when she ran for the Democratic nomination for the first time, she already insisted that supporting US exports would be the central topic of her economic policy. Even back then, she supported tariffs on Chinese imports, which apparently damaged the competitiveness of both the US and EU economies through unfair pricing. In May 2024, Biden actually introduced drastic tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, semiconductors, and minerals. And in the case of EVs, the tariffs even rose from 25% to 100%. And guess what? Harris supports those measures and would likely preserve them if elected. Another challenge for Europe, which will not go away anytime soon, even if Harris becomes president, is that Europe will likely keep on losing its competitiveness vis-a-vis the US. Simply put, the US may well become a much more attractive place for business than Europe, even more so than it is today already, which means that the EU economy would suffer even more than it is suffering now. The main risk here is the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which the US Congress passed in 2022. Over the coming decade, the law will offer billions of dollars in tax breaks for companies producing on US soil, as opposed to Europe or anywhere else. It will also offer subsidies for consumers who opt for a US-made product, such as an electric vehicle, as opposed to a European or a Chinese EV. Plus, it introduces further barriers for US businesses to import their products into the US, and that all could prove especially difficult for the EU's auto industry, which is already not having the best of times anyway. In the extreme case, the IRA could even lead to the auto industry leaving Europe and moving into the US, which would cost us billions of euros in lost revenue. I don't have to remind you, surely, that precisely countries in the heart of Europe are enormously dependent on the European automotive industry and its prosperity. And again, if Harris wins, she will keep the IRA around, so Europe will have to find a way to deal with it. So if Kamala Harris ends up winning the US presidency in November, Europe will most likely stay on the US's radar, at least to an extent. It is likely that she would continue supporting allies on NATO's eastern flank. It is inconceivable, for example, that she would pull the plug on the plan to deploy long-range US missiles to the continent as a deterrent to Putin, which Biden announced in May. It is very possible that people with close links to Europe would have very important jobs on Harris's team. It is not quite at the level of the personal connection Biden has had with Europe, but I mean, close enough. And yet, a lot will change for Europe in the near future. No matter who wins the US election, we just have to accept for a fact that the US sees different priorities as much more important for its national interest. The US national defense strategy labels China as a pacing challenge and the only competitor with both the intent and the power to reshape the international order. So the message is clear. The US considers China a much bigger challenge than Russia.
It comes from China.
And while China may not be waging an aggressive war just yet, unlike Russia, it already has more power than Putin ever had in the US's eyes. And that's quite a chilling thought if you think about it. As a result, Europe would have to shoulder more of the responsibility for supporting Ukraine and should play a much more active role in maintaining the rule of law-based international system. Europe must simply use the time during a potential Harris administration to accelerate defense coordination among willing European partners, to increase military stockpiles and develop European deep precision strike capabilities. With the way things are going, we simply cannot afford to have just a few functioning tanks in our stockpiles, such as Germany. The US might not have either the willingness or the capacity, or both, to come to our help, simply, irrespective of who wins the US presidency in November. Now, what do you think about the prospect of a Harris presidency and its impact on Europe? As always, do let me know in the comments below. And if you like what I do, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks to every single one of you supporting me on herohero.co/PracPulse. See you next time and have a great one.